To say that Mark and I have enjoyed this 3-part series and we're about to enter the third part is probably not the best way to frame it. But we have been grateful to do this series because we know that there are thousands of you who will listen via podcast or watch it on YouTube. And we feel like it's a message that just needs to get out there. It's not that we feel like it. It is a message that needs to get out there. This 3-part series is called When Church Leaders Fight Depression. We're focusing more on pastors, but it can be any church leader. In part 1, we talked about the pervasiveness of depression among church leaders, and again, specifically pastors. In part 2, we talked to church members directly about pastors and church leaders going through depression. We wanted church members to hear from us. We're hoping at least part 2 will get out to the membership, if not all 3 of these. And now we're going to finish this, and we're going to talk directly to pastor, although it could be other church leaders. We will frame it as the pastor. And this third part is called Dear Pastor, When You Are Battling Depression. And just as a word, we talked about this when we talked about suicide among pastors, but just as a word, there's a link there. If you need help, please go to that link, and don't think that there's no one out there that will help you. Mark, this has been our January launch of Revitalize and Replant. It's been a sober topic, but I think you're agreeing with me, a needed topic.
And one we need to visit occasionally and not just one-off, because depression among pastors and church leaders is always going to be prevalent because of the spiritual warfare and the nature of the work. And we need to keep it in the forefront so that it can be dealt with and battled and in a correct way. So yes, it's been an interesting way to start the new year, but a much needed process, I'm sure. And I've enjoyed benefiting from it. Even as we've talked about it, it's helped me even in my life cope with some and deal with some things that I constantly have to deal with.
Yeah. And kind of out of the blue, if you think we're scripted, we have 5 sentences and we go off those sentences and talk about it because we want to have the freedom to go as led and off script, which almost everything we do here. I started talking about Gary Richardson and what a great encourager he is. And I gotta make sure that I don't ever contact my friends and say, hey, you need to listen to this podcast. I'm gonna get him to listen to this series, especially part 2, because he's been such a dear friend to me. Okay. This particular podcast is Dear Pastor, When You're Battling Depression. It's our third of a 3-part series, When Church Leaders Fight Depression. And we're going to talk to you, the pastor, although it could have application with other church leaders as well. By now, you should have part 1. Well, number 1, let me put it that way. You should have number 1 down. If you are battling depression, you are neither strange nor alone. Mark?
Yes, you're neither one of those, strange nor alone, for sure. You know, I've shared it in the previous podcast. That is something that I've struggled with in my own life. I didn't acknowledge it until way up into my 50s, and that was a regret. I should have dealt with it much earlier. I created a lot of my own problems by not acknowledging it, feeling like it was a failure. I didn't want to acknowledge it because I didn't want people to think less of me, and that's a problem there. I mean, you know, sometimes we don't depend enough on the gospel because we want people to like us. So I didn't want people to think less of me. I didn't want my peers to think less of me. I didn't want my denominational leaders to think I wasn't capable. And so I just kept all that to myself. And when you keep it to yourself, it doesn't get any better. It gets worse and it compounds. And it wasn't until really a crisis intervention when some people who cared about me said, we see in you some depression and we want you to deal with it and we want to help you deal with it. And I'm grateful for those people who made that intervention in my life. And yes, you have to acknowledge it and you have to realize you're not alone in it. You're not alone in this. And that's so important because so many times you feel like you look around on social media, look at other pastors, you think, man, they don't deal with this. They're not struggling the way I'm struggling. I don't want to be the only guy who, raises his hand and say, hey, I got problems here. I'm supposed to have all the answers. I'm the pastor, right? No, not in the least, man. You are so vulnerable to the attack of Satan. as he just puts his target right on you, and you're an absolute target for spiritual warfare. And there is no shame in acknowledging, hey, man, I am in a battle right now. I am hunkered down and I need some help, and I need it bad. And there's no shame in that at all. That's a good thing to do. That's a good place to be.
And church member, if you're listening, maybe you decided to pick up the series because someone shared with you part 2, which was a message to church members. If you're listening to this part 3, understand that if your pastor is battling depression, that pastor is not weird. That pastor is not crazy. That is a very normal thing. And when back in the day, Mark, and you and I are both so old now that we have the back in the day comments quite a bit. And by the way, in future podcasts, I don't know how long it'll take, Mark informed me that his room is going to be, where he is right now, is going to be decorated in 60s memorabilia. So I'll look forward to that.
That's right.
You church members, please understand that if your pastor is battling depression, that's normal. That is not abnormal and not weird.
So Martin Luther never pastored a church, but he often preached 150 times a year in Wittenberg. And he got so discouraged that people were not listening to him. They were listening to him, but they weren't changing. There was no noticeable change in their life. They were coming out listening to preach, and then they were, as he said, they would go live drunken lives like they did before. And he was just incredibly frustrated with that. And he became very deeply, darkly depressed. And Martin Luther would have bouts of depression. I think he predicted his own death 16 times. And once he was right, by the way. But But, that's part of depression. You think you're going to die. Every time you get a headache, you look at WebMD and you think, oh, man, this is my last headache. I'm going to die from this. That's part of it. But, I mean, he was always thinking he was going to die. He got to this place in his life where he was so discouraged about his preaching not having any visible impact that he quit preaching for 15 months. He didn't preach a sermon. And his friend Melanchthon thought he may never preach again. So he went through this deep, dark time when he refused to preach. That was Martin Luther. And you want to talk about Charles Spurgeon and his depression that he battled with? Look, I'm here in Kansas City. You can go to the Spurgeon Library. I encourage you to go there. It's such an amazing place. His library is there. Many of his personal letters and papers. The curator of that library is a wonderful young man. He's a member of Warner Road Baptist Church now. That is so cool to me.
Look at that connection.
I know, it's so cool. So he opened up some letters that he had that they'd found that someone had brought to them that were letters that Spurgeon had written while he was on a train, right? He's writing this letter to a friend. We don't know who it is. We don't have the whole thing, but in it, I got my camera out to take a picture of it. He goes, dude, you can't take a picture of that. You can't put that out there. Okay, I'm sorry, I couldn't take a picture of it. I guess I can tell you what it said though. But he said he was writing this letter. He's talking about the downgrade controversy. This is in Spurgeon's own hand, right? He's like, something to the line that I don't know that I can continue to do this. I don't know that I have the ability. I'm so crushed. It's like a man who's depressed is pouring this out. This is Charles Spurgeon. I mean, Pastor, you're in great company if you're dealing with discouragement and depression. I mean, Martin Luther and Charles Spurgeon, we could go on beyond that. It's the primary attack of Satan on us as pastors. The primary attack, the primary tool he has is depression. And in many ways, it's an indication that you're doing what God wants you to do because Satan is coming at you so much. And so for you to ignore that and act like you can't bring it up and talk about it and deal with it is exactly, listen to me, it's exactly what Satan wants you to do. He wants you to try to do this on your own and battle this on your own. And he doesn't want you to reach out and get help.
We're in a 3-part series called When Church Leaders Fight Depression. The first part was why depression is more common in church leaders today. Second part, a message to church members about pastors and depression. And this is a third part, Dear Pastor, when you are battling depression. This one ties into the previous one where we talked to church members. Now we're talking to pastors. Find an advocate among your church members. It hasn't been that long ago where I was in conversation with the pastor, and he had heard me say that I had advocates. And he said, I don't have one. What do I do? I said, take a risk. Go to the person that you think you could trust the most that would be appropriate and tell them some of the things that you've heard from me about an advocate and see what they will do. Well, that piece of advice worked perfectly. I cannot say I haven't been infallible for sure, but there are people that don't know about advocates. And when you ask them to be, they will be. Right, Mark?
Some of them are very gifted at that and very good at it. And they're looking for a way to minister to you. And that's a wonderful way they can do it. Absolutely, Thom.
This third, dear pastor, share with your spouse openly and candidly. Sometimes pastors are notorious not only from keeping it from their church members, but from hiding it, particularly from their spouses. And here's the thing about it. If you've been married any length of time, you can't hide it. So they know you're hiding something, and they may not know the details. They know you're different. I mean, different than your usual different. They know that something is different there. You might as well go on and tell them and talk with them openly. That's part of the marriage relationship.
You know, my wife and I think we have I'm so blessed, just a wonderful open friendship relationship. I just am so grateful for it. But there are still times where she'll say to me, what's going on? What's wrong? And my initial response is always the same, Dr. Rader.
Nothing.
It's nothing. I'm all right. And sometimes she'll let it go, but sometimes she won't. And she'll go, no, you're not. You know, what's wrong? No, I'm really okay, you know, and I'll just move on. And then later on, something will happen and I'll unpack it. And she'll say, look, you need something. Just tell me what's going on. I can't. So there have been times that I've experienced some anxiety attacks, right? If anybody out there is listening has ever done that, you know.
I talked to a pastor 2 weeks ago going through it.
Yeah. And I have the relationship with my wife that I'm able to say, I need you to come and sit next to me. I need you to hold my hand. I need to look in your face. I need to focus on you. And it's exactly what I need at that moment. I don't need to act like it's not a problem. It's not her problem. I don't want her to know about it, because there's this sense of, when you have those kinds of anxiety attacks, focusing on something like that is really important. Touching someone and holding their hand is really important. And so she knows now she can do that for me. And that's but there's still times, you know, I'll get up in the middle of the night and I'll be kind of, you know, freaking out or whatever. And and at that point, I do need to probably let her know sometimes, hey, I kind of need you, but I want to wake her up. I don't want to do that. But yet I would want her to do that for me. I'd be willing to step in and do that. So Pastor, you just got to be in partnership with your wife on this. And that may mean, and maybe I'm getting ahead of us here, Dr. Rayner, that may mean you go to a Christian counselor together, and he'll help you understand how as a couple you can deal with this. Because if you're depressed, it affects her. It affects your children. You think, I'll just keep this to myself. No way in the world is that true. Your depression totally affects them. Your anxiety totally affects them. And they can be an important part of the solution.
Sometimes I am uncertain as a spouse where to draw the line between being open or just whining, you know. And I look at, but I did learn something, and this is a bit of levity and a very serious topic, so I'll introduce it. I serve on an HOA board, and let me say, it is an experience in hell. It is. Oh my goodness! I'm a volunteer, and other homeowners, they snip, they attack, and all that. And I was sharing it with my wife. I've been on this board 3-4 years. I don't know, so 3 or 4 decades probably. Mm-hmm. And I've been on this board, and I just made a resolution a couple of years ago. I'm just not going to share these things with Nellie Jo. I mean, they're inconsequential. I can drop off anytime when I want to. It's a volunteer position, and I'm not going to let it bother me, and I'm certainly not going to let it bother her. Well, we were recently in a conversation with another homeowner. And this homeowner, she follows everything that's going on. And so we're talking about all the things that people have said to me. She's seen them because they're usually posted on the HOA site or on Facebook. And she's seen all the attacks. And Nellie Jo looked at me and she said, I had no idea all this was going on. I said, yeah, I chose not to tell you because it really is inconsequential. And she looked at me and she said, good. Okay. I hope you'll be there if I need you, but good.
Well, there's this two sides of this coin, right? And I think I did a blog on this the other day or something, but your wife is not called to be the pastor of the church. Your spouse is not called to be the pastor of the church. And so don't unload every problem of the church on them. Obviously, we're not talking about that. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about your own personal struggles that you're having with some anxiety and some depression and some of those that you must share with her. But I don't think you need to share every problem that somebody comes to you and every bold-faced text you get talking about how bad a pastor you are. You don't need to unload all that on them. But in terms of, hey, I'm really struggling right now. I'm feeling some anxiety. I'm in this funk. I can't get out of it. I can't find any hope. That you need to share with them for sure.
And this fourth point is we're talking directly to pastors and other church leaders who are battling depression. You mentioned it, Mark, get professional help. Sometimes it's for the pastor, sometimes it's for the pastor and the spouse going together. We have a hotline, which could point you to some professional help as well. And so that information is in the show notes. Getting professional help is not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of strength and openness.
Absolutely. There have been 2 times in my life where I've gone to counseling and gotten help, and both times have been incredibly beneficial. And I mean, I'm still there now. I don't see them on a monthly basis, but I have a doctor and I see them regularly. And he really helps me understand who I am and walk through these things and how to deal with them. He works with my medical doctor. It's a full team effort. And it's made a huge difference in my life. It really has. I can give you a testimony that I am far more useful and far more helpful to the kingdom and a better pastor and a better denominational worker and a better husband and a better granddad and a better dad because of the doctors in my life, both the medical doctors and the counselors who work together that have really helped me battle these kinds of issues than if I'd have tried to do them on my own. I wouldn't be where I am without that. Just be frank about it.
That is such a good word. The 3-part series, When Church Leaders Fight Depression, part 1, go back and listen to it. Why depression is more common in church leaders today. Part 2, I really hope this had a big audience, not for the numbers or clicks, but for the right reason. A message to church members about pastors and depression. And now this part 3, we're talking directly to pastors and, of course, other church leaders as well about it. We're wrapping up this 3-part series. We pray it has been helpful, but we mentioned this in the second part, time off. We mentioned it from the perspective of the church member. You lead your pastor to take time off, and then we now need to talk to the pastor. Whether it is a sabbatical or appropriate vacations or days off, take personal time off. Don't think you have to work every day because everybody expects you to.
Let me give 3 resources if I can. We didn't talk about this ahead of time, but let me give 3 resources and we can put them in the show notes. One is obviously Andy Davis's book called Revitalize. He has a chapter on there on depression. It's worth the price of the book. Every pastor should read that chapter. That's where I got the stories about Martin Luther and Charles Spurgeon. So go ahead and get that book. Second one is obviously the great book by Martin Lloyd-Jones on spiritual depression. And Lloyd-Jones, who was a physician, understood that if you have a biological predisposition to depression, that Satan doesn't give you a pass on that. He drills down on that. And so you have to understand that's an area where he's going to work really hard on you. And so you have to deal that in a holistic way. So Martin Lloyd-Jones' wonderful book on spiritual depression. And then our friend Richard Blackaby wrote a book called Living Out of the Overflow. And it's basically a story of Elijah. And, Elijah just has the most wonderful experience when he calls down the fire from heaven and the prophets of Baal. Richard said that if you dressed up at a costume party as a Hebrew kid in the Old Testament, everybody wanted to be Elijah because he was the greatest superhero, right? What does Elijah do after that tremendous victory? One critic, Jezebel, one woman critic, threatens him, and he not only runs away. Remember, he has a servant, right? And he sends the servant away. And I love what Richard said. He's basically done with ministry. Now, I don't even need you anymore. I'm going to send my servant away. I'm finished. And he goes and hides in a cave. many of you are in that cave. You're done with ministry. You're still going through the motions, but you're done with it. And the most wonderful thing about that book is Richard reminds us that God isn't done with him, and God comes to him in the cave.
That's good.
And the actual answer to your depression is that God's not finished with you, and he'll come to you. And I just want to give you that assurance. He may come to you in a variety of ways, through his word, through some music, through some godly men and women in your life, through your spouse, through a doctor, through a Christian counselor, but he will come to you. And there is a way through this, and you can battle through it. And I can tell you about that. But it's an ongoing battle until we get to heaven. But we're going to be in this fight together because we know that we win. And lastly, I'll end with this. The Apostle Paul did not say, I have danced the good dance and I have walked the good walk. He said, I have fought the good fight. And sometimes, how do you get over depression? People ask me that. People come up to me all the time because they know I've dealt with it. And they say, man, I said, you fight for your joy. You fight for your church. You fight for your family. You fight for your own joy. You've got to battle for it. And many times you don't have the strength to battle. You got to have other people around you that give you that strength. So
good closing word. Thank you, listeners and viewers at YouTube, for walking with us through this 3-part series about when church leaders fight depression. Let me be redundant. Once again, we started off with part 1, why depression is more common in church leaders today. Part 2, we addressed directly the church member, and we wanted the church member to know about what pastors and other church leaders, what their struggles are. And in part 3, we spoke directly to the church leader. We have some links for resources that are there, including a place that you can call if you're in need of urgent conversation. There is help out there. Don't think that there is no help. So Happy New Year, Mark. I know this was a topic of sobriety, but a topic that I think is very necessary. So hopefully it'll be a good 2022 for all who are, everybody, of course, but those who are part of Revitalize and Replant. Thank you as well for joining us on Revitalize and Replant. Go to Church Answers and the YouTube channel. We've just been building that methodically. Go there, give a rating, give a review, give a like. Tell us that you're connected to us, subscribe especially. And also, wherever you listen to the podcast, there are lots of places you can listen to podcasts. Some of you are on iTunes, Google Podcasts, Spotify. So wherever you're listening, and give us a rating and review there. And we'll continue to work alongside you church leaders and all the others who are helping revitalize and replant churches for the glory of God, and be with us as we continue to do this together for his glory. We'll see you in the next episode.